Opium Wars. Most people think wars are fought over land and ideology, but a major war started over just a plant. This is the true story of the Opium War. In the year 1729, the Chinese Empire issued one of the first bans on the consumption and import of opium. In the following decades, Britain, which imported large amounts of tea and silk from China, faced a severe silver deficit because Chinese merchants did not accept European goods and only accepted silver as a form of payment. To compensate for this trade imbalance, the British East India Company expanded opium cultivation in Bengal and exported the substance extensively and illegally to Chinese ports. The expansion of this trade caused a sharp increase in opium consumption in China and brought significant economic and social consequences for the country. In response to this situation, in the year 1839, the Chinese government appointed Lin Zexu as a special commissioner to tackle the opium trade. In Canton, he surrounded the residences of foreign merchants, confiscated and destroyed onshore more than 20,000 chests of opium belonging to British and other merchants. This action, which directly struck Britain's commercial interests, became a pretext for the British government to send its navy to China's coast, starting the First Opium War. British forces with naval and armament superiority won in coastal and river battles, and by capturing key positions pressured the Chinese government. In the end, China, defeated in the year 1842, was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, according to which it paid financial reparations and ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain, and opened 5 ports as treaty ports to British trade. In the year 1856, the seizure of the Arrow ship provided a new pretext for Britain, and the Second Opium War began, a war that this time saw France joining Britain. The Allied forces attacked Canton and advanced north. After battles including at the forts of Taku, they approached Beijing. During this campaign, the Emperor of China's summer palace was looted and burned. These conflicts eventually ended with the signing of the treaties of Tianjin and then the Convention of Peking. In the year 1860, treaties that granted more privileges to Western powers, opened more ports to foreign trade, legalized the opium trade, and ceded parts of the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain. American Revolutionary War. The British Empire made a miscalculation over higher taxes, but the result was the creation of the most powerful country in the world today. On April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord, the first sparks of the American Revolutionary War were ignited when British forces were sent to seize ammunition stores and arrest rebel leaders, but were met with armed resistance from local militias. This military confrontation was the result of years of political tension. Britain, to compensate for heavy war debts, passed laws such as the Stamp Act and the Tea Act to collect direct taxes from the colonies. But the colonists, who had no representation in the British Parliament, deemed this action illegal and resorted to widespread protests and boycotts of British goods. After the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, the Continental Congress formed the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander. On July 4, 1776, the colonies, by issuing the Declaration of Independence, formally announced their separation from Britain, and the conflict escalated from a civil protest into a full-scale war for national sovereignty. During the early years of the war, British forces, due to naval superiority, managed to capture coastal cities like New York. But the unexpected American victories at the battles of Saratoga in 1777 shifted the balance of power and led France to enter the war as America's main ally, providing crucial financial and military support. With the entry of France and then Spain and the Netherlands into the war, Britain had to disperse its forces to defend other parts of the empire against attacks from these countries. The war continued on the southern fronts until in 1781, Washington's army, with the cooperation of the French naval fleet and French ground forces, surrounded the main British army under Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown and forced them to surrender. This heavy defeat shattered London's political will to continue the war, and finally in 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, Britain recognized the independence of the United States and established the borders of this new country up to the Mississippi River. War of 1812. The War of 1812 did not change any borders, but it forever changed America's identity. This is how a nation was forged in fire. On June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. While the empire was simultaneously engaged in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the roots of this conflict went back years, when Britain, to weaken France, imposed extensive restrictions on maritime trade, which also harmed American ships. And in addition, the Royal Navy, with its policy of impressment, forced American sailors into service. Alongside these factors, Britain's support for native tribes in the Northwest Territory, which conflicted with U.S. territorial expansion, led to heightened tensions and pushed Washington's political environment toward war. The war began with initial American invasions. U.S. leaders hoped to quickly capture these areas to force Britain into negotiations, but poor organization, inexperience of the U.S. Army, and effective resistance by British forces and their native allies led to the failure of these attacks. At this stage, the native alliance led by Tecumseh played a key role in halting American advances, and the Northern Front became a war of attrition. In 1813, the battle spread to the Great Lakes region, and the U.S. Navy's victory at the Battle of Lake Erie marked a major turning point. This victory gave Americans control of the region and set the stage for the defeat of British forces and their native allies at the Battle of the Thames, a battle in which Tecumseh was killed, and the native alliance effectively collapsed. After Napoleon's defeat in 1814, Britain was able to send more troops to North America, and the war entered a more aggressive phase. The British fleet, by entering Chesapeake Bay, landed its forces, and in August of that year, after winning the Battle of Bladensburg, entered Washington, D.C., and set fire to government buildings, including the White House and the Capitol. After this operation, British forces moved toward Baltimore, but the successful American defense at the Battle of Baltimore, and especially the defense of Fort McHenry, forced them to retreat. While the war had reached a stalemate and both sides were exhausted by its costs, peace negotiations were concluded, and the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24, 1814. According to this treaty, borders returned to their pre-war status, and neither side gained any lasting territorial advantage. However, due to slow communications, news of the peace did not reach America in time, and the final and one of the most famous battles of the war took place in January 1815 at New Orleans, where American forces under Andrew Jackson repelled a major British assault with heavy casualties. Invasion of Kuwait. Iraq, with one of the largest armies in the world, swallowed its neighboring country in less than 24 hours, but the world gave only 100 hours to return it. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein accused Kuwait of using slant drilling technology to extract oil from the shared Rumaila oil field, and by increasing production beyond OPEC quotas, causing a drop in global oil prices and striking Iraq's fragile economy. In addition, Iraq demanded forgiveness of its war debts from Kuwait, debts incurred during the war with Iran. But this request was opposed by Kuwait after the failure of diplomatic negotiations. Iraqi forces, particularly the Republican Guard units and the army, advanced toward Kuwait with air and armored support, while Kuwaiti defending forces resisted in some areas, but they could not withstand the scale and speed of the Iraqi attack, and most Kuwaiti military units collapsed within a few days. The emir and members of the Kuwaiti government were forced to flee and seek refuge in Saudi Arabia. After fully deploying its forces in Kuwait, Iraq initially established a puppet government called the Republic of Kuwait, and then on August 28, 1990, officially annexed Kuwait as Iraq's 19th province. This military occupation was met with immediate and widespread condemnation by the UN Security Council, and the Security Council issued successive resolutions demanding Iraq's unconditional withdrawal from Kuwaiti territory, with Saddam's continued refusal to retreat. An international coalition led by the United States was formed. In January 1991, this coalition launched extensive attacks against Iraqi forces with Operation Desert Storm, which ultimately led to the withdrawal of the Iraqi army and the end of the occupation of Kuwait after about 7 months. American Civil War. The American Civil War lasted 4 years, but its casualties exceeded the total U.S. losses in World Wars I and II, Korea, and Vietnam. On April 12, 1861, with Confederate artillery firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the American Civil War officially began. The roots of this bloody conflict went back decades of deep differences between the northern and southern states, the most important of which concerned slavery and its expansion into new territories, as well as related economic and political conflicts. The northern states, with an industrial and growing economy and free labor, generally opposed the expansion of slavery, while the southern states, whose economy depended on cotton production and slave labor, saw these policies as a threat to their economic and social system. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860, who opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, marked a turning point in the crisis and led first 7 southern states, and then with the outbreak of war, a total of 11 states seceded from the Union, citing states' rights, and formed the Confederate States of America. The early years 1861 to 1862 were marked by large and bloody battles, and in battles like Bull Run, it became clear that, contrary to many expectations, the war would not be short. On the Eastern Front, Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee were able to show effective resistance against the Union Army in several battles. During this period, the governments of Britain and France, economically dependent on Southern cotton, considered the possibility of recognizing the Confederacy. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring slavery abolished in the rebellious states. In the same year, the military turning point occurred at the three-day Battle of Gettysburg, where the Southern Army's invasion into Northern territory was halted. In the final stages of the war, 1864 to 1865, the Union, relying on industrial superiority, an extensive railroad network, and a naval blockade of southern ports, adopted a total war strategy. General William T. Sherman, with his destructive military campaign from Georgia to the Atlantic coast, targeted the South's infrastructure and economic resources. To break the capacity and will to resist, finally on April 9, 1865. With the Confederate Army collapsing from lack of troops and supplies, the war effectively ended. The American Civil War concluded with Union victory, the official abolition of slavery, and the consolidation of federal government supremacy. And with extremely heavy human casualties, it is considered one of the most devastating conflicts in U.S. history. Berlin Blockade. The Soviet Union imprisoned 2.5 million people in Berlin to defeat the West, but in reality, it trapped itself. On June 24, 1948, the Soviet Union, by cutting off all land, rail, and water routes to the Western-controlled sectors of Berlin, triggered one of the first and largest crises of the Cold War. The roots of this confrontation went back to deep economic and political conflicts between East and West over Germany's post-war future. While the Soviet Union wanted to keep Germany weak and receive war reparations, the United States, Britain, and France were trying to rebuild West Germany's economy. Tensions reached a breaking point when on June 20, 1948, the Western Allies unilaterally introduced a new currency called the Deutsche Mark in the Western sectors to restore economic stability. This action was taken without coordination with the Soviet Union, which considered it a violation of the four-power agreements and an attempt to expand Western influence in Germany. In response to this new currency, the Soviet Union began a complete blockade of West Berlin, cutting off access for about 2.5 million citizens to food, fuel, and essential supplies, to force the West to retreat from monetary reforms or leave Berlin. However, the Western Allies, instead of using military force to reopen the routes, adopted the Berlin airlift strategy. In this massive and unprecedented operation, American and British planes operated around the clock and at short intervals, transporting thousands of tons of food, medicine, and coal through air corridors to West Berlin airports. The operation was so precise and extensive that at its peak, a plane landed in Berlin every few minutes. The Soviet Union, witnessing the gradual failure of the blockade and the strong solidarity of the Berlin population with the West, finally on May 12, 1949, after 11 months, lifted the blockade. This crisis not only led to the formal creation of East and West Germany, but also accelerated the formation of the NATO military alliance and solidified the division of Europe into Eastern and Western blocs for decades to come. Chicken War. Europe thought that, with a chicken tariff, it had protected its farmers, but in reality, it somewhat saved the American auto industry forever. In 1960, with the widespread entry of frozen American chickens into European markets, a trade tension emerged between the United States and the member countries of the European Economic Community. After World War II, industrial chicken production in the United States had increased dramatically, and prices had decreased, so much so that American chicken quickly captured a large share of European markets, and chicken consumption in Europe rose. But local producers in Europe, especially in France and West Germany, who could not compete with cheap American chicken, asked their governments to restrict imports to protect the domestic poultry industry. In response to this pressure, the member countries of the European Economic Community imposed heavy tariffs on American chicken imports. To support local producers, these tariff measures effectively reduced U.S. chicken exports to Europe significantly and intensified trade tensions between Washington and Brussels. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the dispute, including negotiations and talks, failed to end the conflict, and eventually the United States decided to respond with retaliatory action. In 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued an executive order imposing 25% tariffs on 4 categories of imported goods from Europe. These tariffs were implemented in January 1964 and were enacted in response to the reduction of U.S. chicken exports to Europe. In practice, the 25% tariff on light trucks, which later became known as the chicken tax, severely restricted the import of such vehicles into the United States. Over time, the imposed tariffs were lifted, but the 25% tariff on light trucks remains in place to this day. Anglo-Irish Trade War. Peace between Ireland and England began with a strange deal. cows in exchange for coal, the story of the treaty that ended a 6-year war in 1932. With the rise to power of the Fianna Fáil government in Ireland, led by Eamon de Valera, economic disputes between Ireland and Britain began, which later became known as the Anglo-Irish Trade War. De Valera decided to cancel payments related to loans given at the end of the 19th century to Irish farmers for purchasing land under Irish land laws, which, according to the agreement between the two countries, were considered Ireland's obligations. This decision caused Britain to respond by imposing 20% tariffs on Irish agricultural products and other goods. To compensate for its financial losses, since a large portion of Ireland's exports went to Britain, Ireland also imposed reciprocal tariffs on British goods. This action by both sides led to a severe reduction in trade between them, and initiated a long period of economic pressure, which heavily affected Ireland's economy, especially in agriculture. Within Ireland, the government tried to reduce dependence on the British market, and with protective policies for domestic production and encouragement of industrial and agricultural self-sufficiency, pursued local industry development. However, economic hardships, rising unemployment, and pressure on farmers were consequences of this trade war and caused protests and social tensions to increase. In the mid-1930s, with negotiations between the two governments and economic pressure on both sides, the dispute moved toward resolution. In 1935, an agreement called the Coal-Cattle Pact was signed between the two countries, which facilitated the purchase of coal and cattle, and was a sign of willingness to reduce tensions. Eventually, broader negotiations continued, and in 1938, the Anglo-Irish Trade Agreement was signed, which repealed the imposed tariffs and officially ended the trade war. According to this agreement, Ireland agreed to a one-time payment of £10 million to settle remaining debts to Britain. Also, 3 seaports, which had remained under British control since the 1921 agreement, were returned to Ireland, which later proved important for the country's neutrality policy in World War II. Trade War of 894. Bad advisors. Destroy empires not with the sword, but with a single sentence. Advice that indebted Byzantium to its enemy. In 894 AD, as a result of Emperor Leo VI's decision to transfer the Bulgarian trade market from Constantinople to Thessaloniki, an action that sharply increased the cost for Bulgarian merchants and threatened their economic interests. This decision was made based on the recommendation of Stylianos Zautzes, one of Byzantium's high-ranking officials, and caused severe discontent among Bulgarian traders because it made direct access to eastern trade routes difficult and imposed higher taxes on them. When Simeon I, ruler of Bulgaria, protested this change, and Emperor Leo gave no response. The disputes escalated into war. In the autumn of that year, the Bulgarians entered Thrace, defeated the Byzantine army, and captured many prisoners and spoils. The Byzantines engaged in other battles to counter the Bulgarians, requested help from the Magyars, nomadic tribes residing in northeastern Bulgaria. The Magyars, with support from the Byzantine navy, entered the border areas, and in 895, in battles defeated the Bulgarian forces, and advanced near the Bulgarian capital. Simeon I, seeing himself in a difficult position, delayed peace negotiations. To be able to ally with the Pechenegs, when the new allies in 896 confronted the Magyar forces suffered a severe blow and were forced to migrate westward. After eliminating the Magyar threat, Simeon moved his army toward Byzantium, and at the Battle of Bulgarophagon in the summer of 896, decisively defeated the Byzantine army. This decisive victory forced the Byzantine emperor to concede to the Bulgarians' demands. The war ended with a peace treaty, in which the Bulgarian trade market in Constantinople was restored. Bulgarian dominance in the Balkans was confirmed, and Byzantium pledged to pay an annual tribute to Bulgaria to secure the release of Byzantine prisoners. Also, according to this treaty, the Byzantine Empire ceded part of the land between the Black Sea and the Strandzha Mountains to Bulgaria. Although the treaty was violated several times in later years, it officially continued until the death of Leo VI in 912. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to follow the channel and share your suggestions for future videos in the comments section.